Hello, everyone. Welcome to India Foundation for the Arts Project Showcase. As some of you know, India Foundation for the Arts, or IFA, is a nationwide independent organization that supports and implements projects in the arts and culture across the country, across forms, disciplines, regions, languages. And in the past 26 years that we have been around, we've made possible about 680 plus such arts and culture projects. And the outcomes and output of these projects are out there in the public domain as films, books, papers, performances, concerts, productions, exhibitions, archival material, websites, and you can see it, enjoy it, learn from it. But other than supporting and implementing these projects, what we also love to do is share these projects with you. Before the pandemic, before March 2020, IFA would travel to different cities, towns across the country, connect up with local hosts, local partners, other cultural organizations, and create opportunities, evenings of presentation where our grantees share their work with the larger audience like yourselves, and we could discuss it over a cup of coffee or tea. But since March 2020, this entire initiative has moved online on sessions like this. Many of you are watching us on Zoom in the webinar format, and some of you are also watching us on Facebook Live. So if your friends have not registered and would still like to watch, you can show them to our online, the IFA FB page, and they can watch us there going live now. Before I request my colleague Suman to tell you a little more about the project that will be shared today, the discussion that we are going to have today, a few basic house rules for how we are going to do this today. So as you know, all the information will be put in the chat. You can share your thoughts, comments on what you're hearing on the presentation that you will witness there. But if you have specific questions, and at the end of the presentation and discussion, we are going to take questions, you can put those questions in the Q&A box, which is here. If you're watching us on Facebook, you can put your questions down as in the comments, and somebody from IFA will let our presenters know what these questions are. So now I hand this over to Suman, my colleague, who will tell you a little more about what you're going to witness today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arundhati, and thank you all for being here this evening. First, a little bit about IFA's Archives and Museums program. The idea is that artists, scholars, academics, and others imaginatively use collections found in archives and museums and make them accessible to the larger public. You might also look at it as throwing new light on old collections. For more details on the program, do check our website. For this particular project, IFA collaborated with the Indira Gandhi Rashtriya Manav Sangralaya, or the IGRMS, Bhopal, one of the only anthropology museums in the country. Professor Sarit Kumar Chowdhury, the then director of the IGRMS, was a great support, and so also Tata Trusts, who made this whole collaboration possible. Abeer curated his site-specific exhibition, Old Roots, New Journeys, in the Chansa, or the Ladakhi kitchen, in one of the outdoor galleries of the museum. He has lived and worked in Ladakh for more than 15 years now, and you'll hear more about his curatorial intentions in his presentation this evening. Interestingly, Abeer's research and exhibition has had a really rich afterlife. He was able to take back the artwork created at the IGRMS to Ladakh, to the people whose narratives he tried to explore. His essay on the exhibition was included in an important publication, and most recently, his forthcoming exhibition draws upon his research and work done for Old Roots, New Journeys. Abeer's presentation today will be followed by a conversation with Latika Gupta. Latika is an art historian and curator based in Delhi, and her research also focuses on the Himalayan region. The permanent exhibition she has curated, Kargil, Crossroads of Trade and Culture in 2015 at the Munshi Aziz Bhatt Museum was supported by IFA. Both Abeer and Latika have represented material from regions that are often considered the periphery, and most importantly, they have tried in their different ways to move away from the popular narratives that characterize these places. They will be joined by Chemit Dorje, an artist from Ladakh, who has also had a long association with Abeer. He created the centerpiece, the Mother Spindle installation, which we have reproduced on our invitation card for this event. The conversation and the questions after the presentation will be handled by my colleague Tanveer Adsi, who looks after the arts research program at IFA. I now invite Abeer to make his presentation. Welcome, Abeer.
Hello, everyone. Just give me a moment to get the tech sorted. I hope everyone can see the presentation. Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'd like to thank IFA for providing this opportunity to reflect upon this project and bringing us all together for this conversation. So thank you so much, Suman, Arundhati, Tanveer, Darshana, Bishudeep, for painstakingly putting this together. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Shorit Kumar Chaudhary and Sri Surya Pandeji at the IGRMS, along with their colleagues, especially from the fabrication and the photography department. It was an incredible learning opportunity, and the time we spent in IGRMS campus was truly a memorable one. And I think I can speak for Chimit. It was for both of us. An ongoing project like this has a considerably large time span and numerous collaborators and friends who have helped and participated in various ways. I wish to thank all of you for being around, for whenever I needed a chat or a lift home when I was stuck somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Ladakh. But especially to Gulzar and Chimit, who continue to bear with me and my crazy plans through all these years and in such positive and contributing spirit. And then finally, I'd like to thank Lamo and especially Monisha, as none of this would have been possible if Lamo hadn't existed. I wish to thank her for inviting me for the first set of workshops that we conducted back in 2010, and Lamo for continuing to do the work that they are doing with youth and the artists in Ladakh. Thank you, Suman, again for the introduction. As she mentioned that I have spent a large span of time in Ladakh, and a lot of it is actually spent in discussions around heritage, conservation, and education for the Archie Association India, an organization that I run. It involves a lot of mundane brick and mortar stuff. However, it does link quite well with my personal interest in material culture, archives, and the ideas of making. And I shall attempt to trace, rather give you a glimpse of that journey this evening. So we start this evening's presentation with two simple questions. Can the object in an ethnographic museum give us new perspectives on our globalized present? Now, the act of collecting and curating, especially cultural objects, in traditional museums, are often defined by categories such as folk, tribal, indigenous, and they kind of thrive on notions of authenticity, either of the maker or the site of its making. And thus narratives of cultural memory, identity become a very integral part of it. And quite often they get linked with narratives of nationalism, whether they are political or religious. And display strategies often follow this path, so they rely very heavily on these narratives and somehow kind of frame, the journey of these artifacts, from the home to the museum collection, or commercial spaces even, such as souvenir shops and cafes. But essentially, and this is the important thing for us to remember, that for the communities themselves, these objects have often remained a bridge between time and space, and they codify certain kinds of memory. especially when seen within contexts of migration, urbanization, and the making of a global economy. So with these thoughts, we come to the next question that I've posed, which is how can curatorial interventions with contemporary art practices engage? And what kind of experience can it create thus? Ideas of contemporary art practices enable the amplification of a set of concerns beyond the ideas of making, that is the skills involved in the making or the aesthetics that they deliver, into first a much wider field of cultural production. They are able to incorporate narratives of a more diverse set of agents, facilitating perhaps a more hybrid and a more plural experience. That is very important. Providing also provocations for the audiences and stretching, the limits of interpretation, beyond their classifications, just as objects of craft or antiques or tourism souvenirs. And it is with some of these thoughts in our mind that we venture into the idea of ethnography. Because when we speak of ethnographic objects, the research around it also becomes quite central. In 2010, we were able to. In 2010, LAMO initiated a mapping of Old Town of Leh through a series of workshops around visual documentation and oral histories. The process involved young research scholars and artists who joined LAMO at the time for a fellowship, and it developed into an exhibition around water in Old Town. This was a very rare and special introduction to Ladakh through the microcosm of Old Town, once a focal point of the cultural life of Ladakh. Now, some of you might recall the first frame that I had put in with the Leh Palace, which dominates the sort of spatial imagination of Leh. And the inhabited portion just below it, which is what we refer to as Old Town, the original inhabitants of that region. But also this slide tries to show you two images looking down from the palace. So the one on the left looks at Old Town, or rather the extension of it, which goes into the polo ground, and which is where all the official and state events are still held. And on the right, the image that you see is another view from the palace, which has this straight street, which is the main bazaar, which is also a kind of central theme. This engagement with LAMO in 2010 was not just a very in-depth introduction to this space, but it was also an introduction to Chimit. He was one of the people who were part of the workshop, and a group of friends of his with whom I have been in conversation since. And as you will see, we continue to return to Old Town more often than we ever thought. In 2010, one must mention that this exercise that we were conducting was truncated by the disastrous flash floods that took place in Ladakh. But interestingly enough, it only deepened our understanding of that space and built much more long-lasting friendships. So as part of the photography exercise, one of the first things that we did is we started documenting the space. And it helped us identify patterns in which the space is organized and the way it is used, both the space as well as the resources, in this case, water. And this, again, I want to flag, is a very, very important point of entry into, this sort of vast history and heritage that Old Town encapsulates, to be able to understand that context and peg yourself into a frame of this sort of evolving urbanism that Leh was and is going through even right now. And more importantly, in that process, it was an opportunity for us to engage with the people. It was an introduction to the people of Old Town and the way that diverse social groups organize themselves and their activities around this space. The Old Town once housed the nobility of Ladakh, which has changed since. And among others, as I said, they accommodate a huge group of vast migrant labor populations of Ladakh. They provide accommodation, storerooms, workshops. And to me, this is a very important thing again, because it kind of is the kind of backstage to the bazaar, which becomes the focal point of our research. And it's very important. I mean, the reason why I kind of ventured the introduction of this presentation with this is that it's very important for us to remember that this is a very important anchor point to the bazaar and to the cultural space, the sort of, that Old Town is, which continues to be in many ways the sort of socio-economic political epicenter of Ladakh, and then move into a slightly larger context. And this context is, of course, some of us are familiar with this idea that Ladakh has been a crossroad of Central Asian and subcontinental trade, written extensively by various historians and scholars like Janet Rizvi, for instance. And my discovery, however, was, through this research that I was able to engage with, and here some links will be shared with you, through the exploration of Islamic visual and material culture. So for instance, the map that you see on the left of your screen shows you how Leh through antiquity was linked with a vast sort of circulation of Central Asian trade. And the one on the right tells us the manner in which Ladakh is today, where it is one of the districts which has two very, very important international borders, one with Pakistan and one with China. And this brings us to the point that we also need to, and this was already mentioned by Suman in her introduction, that how do we visualize, imagine the periphery, how do we go beyond this idea of this sort of nationalist, narrative around a kind of militarized borderland, so how do we kind of reach out to the people? How do we kind of reach out to the sort of cultural evolution that is happening in the process? As I was mentioning that a large part of my research was around Islam, it was a fantastic opportunity to rediscover rather, the diversity that Ladakh was and is even today, and develop a better understanding of the histories of its syncretic past. So for instance, again, the slide on your left is the Horse Zuljana. It's an artifact, it's an iconography that is used very commonly during Muharram in Ladakh, as elsewhere. And in this this particular painting becomes very important. It's a kind of gouache on wood, which depicts Zuljana in a completely Buddhist Thangka style. And interestingly enough, he's adorned by a kind of Yarkandi rug as a saddle. And that links us to the image on the right, which is a set of carpets that was there at the erstwhile Jama Masjid in Ladakh. We'll see visuals of it just after this. Of course, these textiles have now been moved to the Central Asian Museum, which is right next to it in Chutaranda. But these textiles talk about what we were talking about, the syncretism, the sort of, a kind of aesthetic that evolved from a pan-regional interaction, over centuries. So in that image, you see a rug from Tibet, you see something from Yarkand, you see a Turkish rug, you see a Kashmiri rug. And all of these textiles somewhere sort of set the aesthetic undertone. So while mapping both production and circulation of artifact, then, kind of one discovers that these sort of multiple agencies, local, regional, international, they continue even today. So for instance, if you were to step into a mosque or a khanka or an imambara in Leh, you would still see prayer mats, for instance, what are known as jainamas, which are being brought back from pilgrimage in Iraq and Iran, or as far as Turkey or even Indonesia. But they are arriving now in Ladakh via Delhi, which becomes the first port of call. The study of the Islamic visual and material culture, which included the spaces and the buildings, also points at the transformation that the region was going through. And this is perhaps the last point that I want to make before we go into the sort of central ideas of this presentation, that it gives us an idea of the socioeconomic changes over that have been happening over the past few decades. And it adds a very, very important layer of understanding the aesthetics and the manner in which they have evolved over the years. So for instance, I have taken the opportunity to share a couple of archival images with you. So the one on the extreme left on the top is the original building of the Jama Masjid as it was made in mud and brick. And it was perhaps like this, we can imagine, through the 19th century. The one in the middle is the same building, but with this beautiful wooden lantern, which has now been recreated in the final form that this building exists in at the right bottom. However, in the period of the research, and that image on the top right is what the mosque looked like, and as it was reconstructed in concrete somewhere perhaps in the early 80s, and was like that till 2014, 15, 16, when the bazaar was reconstructed and it was made pedestrian again. So in that image, you actually still see cars in the main bazaar. Moving on now to the sort of central point of this presentation, the engagement with IGRMS. Suman has already mentioned that it is one of the most important and perhaps the only anthropological museum in India. And they had a vast collection of what we call cultural objects from across India. And most importantly, they had a very important collection of Himalayan objects, or objects from a Himalayan collection. And one had heard about it. I had never really had a chance to visit it. And this fellowship was a very, very important opportunity to be able to visit and be able to engage with it so closely. And, I would just like to reiterate that the slides that we went through before were actually the contexts or the ideas with which one actually entered the archive or the collections at the IGRMS. And those being that, on one hand, while I was handling the affairs of Archie Association, which was bringing me much closer to ideas of conservation and the materiality of things, but a lot of parallel conversations were going on because of my personal research with artisans and craftsmen. And one was already trying to imagine, what would be the connections that could be existing even today with the rest of the Himalayas. So for instance, in this picture, I would like you to take note of the spinning wheel that we see on the image on the right, which will become a very important aspect for us. Now, this image is of the IGRMS. The image on the right is something that I had taken sitting in the cafe or the space that we would go up for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And it overlooks the Himalayan habitat, the space. And there are a couple of images that were given to me recently very generously by the IGRMS of other buildings from Himachal, from Kinnaur, from Kulu, and something from Sikkim. These buildings constitute the Himalayan village and brings us to the Chansa, which is the point of our engagement, really. So the IGRMS created the Chansa as a permanent installation as part of the Himalayan village, which is an open air exhibition. The edifice of the Chansa, though, was recast in concrete and had visual elements of traditional Ladakhi buildings in wood. Inside, one finds a sort of large traditional oven and a set of shelves known as the lungs, and floor seating with these low tables which are known as chokses. I'll shift to a couple of images of the Chansa from Ladakh. The important thing is that the kitchen, we have to remember, is a very dynamic space. The one on the left again is a picture from a heritage homestay in Stoke called the Gyapthago House. And they have kind of tried to preserve the kitchen as it were. But I have purposely shared with you all a set of images on the right, which also indicate that this kitchen is not a static space. And that says something not only about our idea of culture, and the idea of cultural production, that it's constantly evolving. It's a kind of evolution that we are trying to sort of understand and therefore represent. The kitchen is also in certain ways a kind of archive. It's a vernacular archive, and not just of objects, but also of stories. It not only showcases generations of artifacts, but this is also a space where people meet even today, and they gather. In the winter, especially, this is perhaps the warmest room in the house, and very often I have even slept in the kitchen with all our friends, because this is where you gather and you chat and you have dinner and then you sleep off. The kitchen also, finally, is a very, very important marker of the social, the kind of interaction that goes on. So therefore, it is not just a space in the house, but also something that reflects on the society itself. Perhaps it's important to remember that the evolution of the kitchen is also something that constantly reflects not just personal aspiration and sort of mobility, social mobility, but also economic prosperity. So from the kitchen, or from these ideas of looking at objects within these spaces, we move to the collections that were there in the IGRMS. Now, how do we define these? How do we define a Himalayan material culture? What is Himalayan, if at all? So these were, as I mentioned, objects and spaces, recreated and collected from across the Himalayas. So stretching from Kashmir and Ladakh to Himachal, Uttarakhand, and then to Sikkim and right up to Tawang in Himachal Pradesh. So these objects arrived from all of these spaces, including some of these. What we see here are a set of kettles, which are a very important part of the sort of tea drinking culture or the ritual that is present in this region. And at the bottom, you see a set of textiles, but we also see where these textiles came from. So the first two images at the lower panel are these sort of sheepskin, they're called shlokas. They are a kind of cape that are worn by the women in this region. And this is common to perhaps even regions like Spiti and Tawang, as I was mentioning. And then you see the sort of red textile, which is sort of found very commonly in Changthang. And the patterns on it echo the weaving of Kinnaur, for instance. And then there are these brocades. The one that you see here is a very elaborate Tibetan style bogue. It's quite large. It's made out of Gyasar brocades. And, it has those beautiful tassels in rainbows. We'll again come back to that point. And these objects, they not only are connected through a set of raw materials or through a set of processes of making, but they also address a set of local requirements and functions. So these are to do with the kind of geographic and climatic conditions that these objects are found in. So we are still trying to unpack this idea of Himalayan material culture. And more importantly, these objects continue to exist and they continue to be in circulation. These are not just museum objects, they are objects that we were then able to go and map at the main bazaar in Leh, where they are sold either as antiques or in commercial forms. But the most important point about it is that these objects are drawn from daily life and they are found commonly in homes across regions of Ladakh, rural, urban, and across social and religious groups. So we initiated this sort of research to build a kind of fresh set of narratives. We went back to the bazaar and we went back to Ladakh to set a kind of, re-look at these objects and see what they tell us about, the kind of various streams of cultural production, that are coming together in Ladakh, or about commoditization, for instance. So these, so we went back to the bazaar and we mapped these objects and the process of their making, the manner of their use, the kind of changing patterns of circulation. And these would often lead to conversations around the transformation of trade routes. I mean, there have been shifts in the political boundaries. There is also an evolution of these objects from those that were being made locally. So for instance, the two textiles which are in the middle, in the center, the blue one with those sort of circles, it's a kind of local dyeing tradition called Thigma, where they are sort of woven and dyed in panels and then stitched together. And then the one in the middle, which is on a green base, is actually an embroidered bogue, which kind of uses Buddhist symbols in them. And the ones on the extreme right in the lower panel also show us, the kind of brocades or the kind of textiles, sort of very rich textiles that were arriving into Ladakh, whether they were coming from the subcontinent, so whether they were being produced in Banaras or they were coming from as far as China. Earlier, these would be traded along the trade routes and would come directly to Ladakh, but nowadays they would sort of circumvent a much longer track and arrive via Delhi. And another interesting point before we move ahead is that, and I'm kind of focusing on this, on one or two objects in this presentation, otherwise it would get sort of rather lengthy, is, this idea of the kettle and this base pot. So the two objects that you see on the top are actually twin objects. The first one is in brass and copper. The second one is in clay. Both of them are, as I said, very, very commonly seen in Ladakh even today, but they are hinged on this concept that the tea needed to be kept warm. So there was a base pot where you would have embers on which you would put the pot. But then there is a very interesting technological shift that happens, where with the coming of the thermos flask, these objects kind of somewhere lose their daily use, and they kind of become ritual objects even within homes. And today, while people still consume them, but they are kind of used as gifts, so they are perhaps used as part of trousseaux or as more sort of cultural offerings, at ceremonial occasions. The idea of the flasks themselves are very interesting because they at one point were reaching directly from China across the border, but now a large part of them are actually produced in India, and they are kind of made to look Chinese in one way or another. And the last point here is that these flasks also, the sort of surface decoration that you see, the way that they are ornamented, also has a role to play in the homes. So which community adheres to what is also a very interesting thing. So there are some very, very religious, a lot of flasks with a lot of very religious motives. And then there are ones, I mean, unfortunately, I've not been able to put a picture of that here, but there are flasks these days that you will see, which will have an image of a dargah or a famous mosque on them. So these objects came together as part of the space that we recreated inside the Chansa. So this is the first view of the inside of the Chansa. And one of the most important installations we did, where we put the bogs at the back. So we combined the bogs at the IGRMS and the ones that we got from Ladakh. And it already gives you an idea of what the installation was trying to talk about, but we'll return to that conversation in a bit. The installation, before I go into the individual artworks, I would just like to mention the main theme, rather, that we were looking at is to try and not just archive and present the research as part of these installations, but also in some ways respond to this notion of culture that we are talking about, this notion of dynamism, this notion of evolution. So we were looking at local production, regional trade, the kind of shift from the Central Asian Himalayan circulation to something that has been completely subsumed by subcontinental production and circulation. So everything now that reaches Ladakh, or the majority of it, reaches by road or by air from Delhi. And, one also has to remember that this process has perhaps only now in the last couple of decades come to a complete fruition with the integration of a neoliberal economy. The other element which is important is that we were constantly referencing back and forth between the bazaar. So, while there are the shifts in circulation because of the borders, while there is a shift of production. So for instance, you will see here that some of the wares that are being sold are actually not the ones that are being produced locally in Ladakh, but they are being produced in production centers outside. So for instance, Moradabad and Aligarh become a very important center for the production of metalware. Saharanpur is where a lot of the woodwork gets outsourced to, and Badoi near Banaras is where a lot of the rugs and stuff get made. But more than that, there is also a shift in the consumption pattern. There are availability, there is today an availability of cheaper alternatives, that people can use. So for instance, if I draw your attention to the center of the image on the left, you have the gurgur tea maker, the butter tea maker, the churner. And in this case, PVC pipes have been used, to make it, which were originally made in wood. So in some ways, we were drawing the references from the bazaar, and we were trying to sort of replicate a new arrangement of objects, which would form the kind of backdrop to the artworks that we were going to present. So coming to the first installation, it was called Welcome to Ladakh 2. And this installation, this is the first installation that you encountered as you entered the space. So you kind of enter and you see this in the beginning. This installation actually was developed out of an installation that Chimit had earlier made when he was a student at Jammu. So the two images on the extreme left of the screen are the first iterations of this sculpture. And for the project in IGRMS, we tried to expand that idea. We literally broke the sculpture in half. And in the extreme right, you will see that we added these screens in the middle of it. And that is where we tried to kind of locate the research. We tried to kind of put in, the kind of research that we did in terms of the photo documentation, so that people could also see, the range and the variation of, the manner in which these objects exist today. But before we move on, just a little note on the form of the sculpture itself. Now, one of the most, and this is perhaps the most exotic set of images that you will see in this presentation. So we took references, or even for the original artwork that Chimit made in Jammu, the references that were taken were from the ceremonial dress that the ladies wear, whether it is for a marriage or for a state occasion, or for some special occasion at home, or the visit of a of a senior Rinpoche, where this sort of chapskyan, this pot that this lady is holding in her hands in the extreme left is kind of used, because that is how they would be, they would greet their guests. And the image in the middle, the lady is wearing a hat, which is known as a tibi, and the image on the extreme right, the shoe. So there were these three objects that were kind of merged, and that is what turned into this installation. And on the surface of the installation, Chimit kind of worked through a set of motifs and a set of, so there is somewhere over here a swish of the Nike shoes. There is, the patterns from the Tigma, but there are also contemporary emblems and symbols, that come from industrial production. So this in some ways, was an opportunity for Chimit to kind of also respond, to the cultural change, that he himself had been witnessing, and then add a layer of the archiving, of the research into the body of that installation. So you kind of make the research and the archiving as part of the display. I will just show you a couple of slides or a couple of images from what went into those screens in the installation. On the extreme left, you see the workshops of some of the metalsmiths in Chilling, who are fortunately alive even today, but they have a considerably smaller range of production, because they are individuals who are producing. Then in the central column, you see the potters from Likir, who recreate some of these objects in pottery. But interestingly enough, and this is where the bazaar comes in, we also went and looked at the repairmen, and these continue to be Nepalis, Nepali repairmen who actually sit and repair some of these objects in the old town. Subsequently, we were also trying to map these objects across the spaces that they occur in. So on the left, again, you have a set of images. The one on the top right is from the Skurbuchan Museum. The one in the middle is from the Sankar Gompa. The one at the very bottom is from the Munshi Museum in Kargil. In the central column, you see these objects in homes of erstwhile trading families. This one is from the family of Dr. Deen Khan in Old Town in Leh again. In the middle, we see a clay a pot, which is at the Grand Dragon in, the Grand Dragon Hotel in Leh. And at the bottom, and this picture I added there just to kind of show how, these sort of forms are constantly evolving. It's from a friend's house in Tia, where, a much more contemporary and Western looking pot has perhaps replaced these objects in daily use today. And on the extreme right, you also see how these objects appear in antique shops, in a jewelry shop, where, over here, there is a beautiful silver and gold kettle that has been made in, and being sold from Moti Market. And below, as I was mentioning, the sort of cheaper reproductions of them that flood the market today. Now that brings us to the second installation, which was obviously a tribute to the textiles of Ladakh. Monisha, for instance, has written, I don't know if she's here, but she's written extensively about the textile traditions of Ladakh. But what we were trying to look at is also how we could bring in ideas of its making, because it was such an important and an integral part of the cultural life of Ladakh. So for instance, even a few decades ago, if your mother was unable to spin and weave cloth for you, then what would you wear? When you did not have the option of buying, fleece jackets and down jackets. The skill of spinning and weaving was almost as important as anything else, as perhaps cooking or being able to farm. And this therefore became a very integral part of the cultural process. And the next image also shows you the top of the installation, which was again something that we brought in from a previous work that Chimit had done and expanded into this installation. This was a work that Chimit had done called Mother Spindle, from where the installation gets his name. And there is a very beautiful, heartwarming story about that he told me about this young girl, a young bride, perhaps in her mid-20s, who was, just about trying to learn to spin, and was obviously not doing a great job out of it. So, the spindle was not very even, and the threads were sort of falling apart, and she was sort of still trying to, to get good at it, and this fiberglass structure was actually a tribute to that lady. So, And finally, of course, when you look at the sort of, the sort of rainbow of colors, which culminate into this, it kind of is a tribute, to the kind of beauty and to all the influences, that have been imbibed into the textile traditions of Ladakh. They remind us perhaps, every time I look at it, they always remind me of the tassels that we see below the bogs, these capes that I was showing you earlier, or the prayer flags, which also uses some of these primary colors. So there's a red, white, green, blue combination from there. So this is the kind of work that we try to do at IGRMS, but it did not sort of end there. We, like Suman had mentioned, that our main aim was, and this was kind of part of the budget, so to say, that IGRMS made available to us, that these objects have to be shipped back, and they did a fantastic job in packing and sending them back to Ladakh. So these objects were then brought back and set up, and I'll come to that slide in a minute, where they were sort of brought back to Ladakh and set up in a space which is now being run and being used by the Progressive Artist Group in Ladakh. But before we come to that, some of these ideas, as Suman also mentioned, has now fed into a new exhibition that we are imagining. The process that I had mentioned earlier that Lamo started in 2010 has now created a very, very exciting young group of artists. I mean, I have added here the name of the 5 artists who are participating in the exhibition that we are imagining in Delhi at some point. But there are more. And now there are many more people who are actually trying to venture into contemporary art or modern art. And this is where it becomes important, because we have to remember that the contemporary art practice in Ladakh has to balance this tremendous weight of tradition. And in this case, it is interesting for us to look at perhaps what happened in Tibet in the early 2000s, with the Sweet Tea House movement, and the way a certain group of people moved away from the classical traditions of painting, of Buddhist painting, and tried to create a space for more critical exchange, for a much more secular kind of art practice where they're looking at ideas and imaginations beyond the religious. And the curatorial narrative for this new exhibition tries to locate itself in that space, but then moves forward, in the manner in which Ladakh is today trying to rediscover itself. Because some of us might know that about 2 or 3 years ago, I think it was 2019, when Article 370 was abrogated and Ladakh was made into a union territory. So in some nationalist narratives, after a very long period of time, Ladakh has now returned to being a region of its own. But it's also a matter of time to see how they sort of renegotiate their relationship with the rest of the Himalayas. I would end this conversation with a little view of the space that I was talking about. It's called the Spindle Art Cafe and Studio in Ladakh. On the left, you see some images of it. This is also an opportunity to go back and return to Old Town. These are 2 very important buildings of 2 very important families, the Kalmak and the Onpo family, which was sort of merged into this building and restored by the Tibet Heritage Fund, and now is being used by artists both as galleries, spaces where art lessons are given to the young people of Ladakh. But more than that, it is also a space for presentation, for conversation, and just sort of hanging out and interaction. I kind of would like to end here and perhaps sort of move into a more conversational part of this and see if we need to go back to some of those slides. Yeah. Latika?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi. My name is Latika, and I've had the good fortune of knowing Abeer now for over a decade. And witnessing his work across different sorts of disciplines in conservation, in ethnographic studies, in design, etc., and also having the good fortune of traveling with him in Ladakh, most recently in October last year. I'm sorry that Jimit isn't here with us, because
Yeah.
I would have loved to have asked him a couple of questions as well. But just to say, Abeer has already mentioned LAMO, the Ladakh Arts and Media Organization, really the first space of its sort, not just in Ladakh, but I think it continues to remain extremely unusual and rare in the context of India per se, working as it does across disciplines, visual arts, music, etc. And now with the Spindle Art Center, which again, I had the good fortune of being able to visit in October. And I would have loved to have asked Chimits what led him to set it up, because it is a sort of self-sustaining model with very deep sort of pedagogic imperatives. And like you said, a space where people can just hang out. Perhaps you could also speak a little bit about this, Abeer, which you already have done, the location of Old Town. And the Spindle Art Center is also in a restored old building in the Old Town. Why does this space continue to be important? The place of the Old Town continue to be important, and how do you think it may inform? And this is a question that Lamo, I know, has addressed so beautifully in terms of its location below the palace as well. But what would the ideal future, in your conversations with Chimit and the others who are a part of the Spindle Art Center, what would their sort of ideal futures for this institution be? And I'm sorry, I'm putting you in a position of answering for them.
Understandable. I mean, I'm wondering why he's not here. It's a bit worrying, but I'll find that out in 15, 20 minutes when we finish. To come to the question, I'll have to first put on the Achi hat, the Achi Association hat, because, the idea of adaptive views of heritage precincts is not new. It's something that has happened across Europe in many, many places, in France and Italy and Germany and Switzerland. And this process in lay itself is not new. Like you said, that Lamo was one of the pioneers of this, where they took Munshi House and Gyao House and combined them into this fantastic art center. And as I said, and Monisha has just written a comment. Thank you. I was hoping you were here, Monisha. The idea being that, these kind of spaces have a history of transformation. So I already mentioned that the old house once hosted the nobility of Ladakh. So just below the royal palace, this is where the prime ministers, so there's the Lonpo House, there's the Munshi House, which is the accountant general, and so on. And somewhere in the mid 20th century, these spaces, these people moved out of Old Town. And in the 60s and 70s, this is where it kind of transformed itself into it breaks my heart to use this word, but almost like a slum, because this is where cheap housing was available for migrant labor. And it is only in the period of the last 20 years, that some of these houses are being now restored, and a new imagination of how they can be sustainable, like you said. So while Lamo is an art center and works extensively with grants and funds and so on and so forth, there are also these initiatives by young local artists, and Chimit Studio is not the only one. Kashi, who is the other participant in the exhibition in Delhi, has a very similar space. And it's very important to mention that as part of his artistic practice, he's actually taken on the job of restoring the house himself. And over the last couple of years, I've seen how bit by bit, he's sort of recreating the house and creating it into a space where he can meet people, where he can have, gatherings and screenings and conversations. And these spaces, as we know, are extremely important, and they are really shrinking. So it's very important for us to try and protect these spaces. Now, coming to it from the artist's point of view, as you were saying, and this brings us to the point of why we have constantly tried to, or whenever we've done a project like this, we've tried to take it back to Ladakh, because this is an opportunity for us to re-examine this question of, and this is something we've spoken about, these sort of curators, moving into the periphery and sort of extracting and commissioning and identifying tradition, and then showcasing it, in these great cities of the world, in New York and Paris and London. But with globalization, perhaps one of the more empowering moments of globalization is that now these spaces themselves need to build that agency, to be able to produce, to be able to display, and most importantly, to be able to have a certain amount of hold on the artifacts that they're producing. So we are in conversation to try and see perhaps whether this setting or this space can be taken to another layer of formality, where there is a space from where curators don't have to, they don't have to double guess but they can arrive somewhere and they can actually sit. So literally transforming it into a gallery, not perhaps in the economic model that they follow in places like Delhi or Calcutta or Bombay, but in a way that they can organize themselves more formally and articulate their concerns. Because again, I mentioned it very briefly, and this is my last point, is that one of the troubles that we always face is that when you're looking at a contemporary art or art from these regions, they constantly get tagged. Either they get tagged in those tribal folk, which we can discuss later, what those tags do to them, or in these kind of Buddhist or Himalayan kind of contexts. But where is a pan-Himalayan context? Is there one? So then it kind of allows us to ask questions like that. So obviously the context of art production in Ladakh is very different from what is going on in perhaps in Nepal or perhaps in Bhutan, which is also engaging with contemporary. So return that agency.
Yeah. So just in the interest of time, because I know that there are some questions in the chat box and in the Q&A box as well. I had 2 or 3 questions, but I'll just sort of club them together because they're not always like a question for you to answer, but just thinking with you and with your presentation. One of the things was, I wanted to ask you about the title of your presentation itself, which is so linked to the work that you do, right? But in which you bring together ethnography and contemporary art, right? So if we think of ethnography as a mode of study, sort of most often done by an outsider, almost always, right? Of a community that is not their own. And then contemporary art practice as a mode of making, and in this formulation of contemporary Ladakhi art by Ladakhis themselves. So one question I was thinking about is, what is the bridge that links these two, right? Another sort of related question, which you sort of ended the last thing that you were saying with. So you had an exhibition at the IGRMS where Chimit responded to the Changspa and the Himalayan village in Bhopal at the museum, and then curating an exhibition for viewers in Delhi as part of the curatorial intensive South Asia, where I think one of the central questions you're asking is there a contemporary in Ladakhi art, right? And then the work goes back to Ladakh, both the IGRMS, which is now cited in Spindle, and the CSI exhibition. So what changes with a change in site, right? So particularly with art created in response to a particular place. And 2, curatorially, do viewers' perceptions impact the questions that you're asking as a curator? So for instance, the central one, is there a contemporary in Ladakhi art? Who is this question being addressed to and why, right? And in the absence of a sort of site that has its own, let's say, dynamic histories of evolution or just histories of transformation even, when the exhibition is being held, let's say in a neutral gallery in a city like Delhi, how do you avoid the pitfalls of replicating, let's say what you even call the exotic image when you showed the traditional clothing, or an ethnographic museum model that shows the supposed periphery to the mainland other? Why is it important then to show this exhibition or this work in Delhi for the artist and for you as a curator, right? And then the question of materiality, because so much of your work is rooted in a study of that, right? Is that, how does this inform your work as a curator of contemporary art, especially in the context of a phrase like contemporary Ladakhi art? What would that look like? Why is it not just contemporary art made by Ladakhis, but contemporary Ladakhi art, which is recognizably so, but you had that word secular in your presentation somewhere, which doesn't fall back on older modes of, let's say, tradition, et cetera, et cetera. So just a bunch of comments and thoughts and questions. Sorry.
Okay,
yeah.
okay. This is going to take me a couple of minutes, so please bear with me. So there are essentially 4 questions that you asked, but I'll begin with the first one, which was around ethnography itself. You would be familiar with it, but I hope some others in the audience are as well, that we have to remember that this period between 2010, 11, 12 is also the period that I was jumping back and forth between Bombay and doing Cinema City. And this is also post my visual anthropology gig at Goldsmiths, right? So one of the things that was most important is to kind of set this, to sort of set the ethnographic context and to sort of challenge this idea of the other. This is where, and this is why I started with the slides that I did, that while we were doing the very similar kind of research in Bombay for Cinema City, in Ladakh, the imagination or the expectation was to immediately jump into the exotic. But, how does one kind of bypass that and create an actual context or a ground on which one can stand and then look at heritage or then look at other things? So as I said, I mean, of course, there are ideas of autoethnography and all, which are still quite new in this part of the world, but ethnography is not essentially at all about studying the other anymore. I mean, contemporary anthropology is not at all about studying the other. It is much more about studying the self. And that is a very important trigger. So one of the things that I would like to sort of end this part of your question was, and which is why I kept reiterating that quite naturally in my presentation, is that, the circumstances with which I met with Chimit or Gulzar or the extended set of people eventually, there was a relationship that was developed from being a facilitator to being a workshop resource person, but that did eventually, and this is what I take credit for, that it then transformed into a friendship. That we just hang out. I mean, it's not that every time I meet Chimit we talk about art. We, like, for instance, this year when we were finishing our work at ENSA, I actually told him that why don't you just come along and look at the stones, the slate stones, the yamangs of Ladakh. It might just trigger some idea of an installation in the future. So I'll return to this idea at the end with your question on materiality. But coming from there, I think this also allows us to come into this idea of the site, the shifting sites and audiences that you were talking about. That once one is able to have that conversation, or once one is being able to be in conversation with the artists who are producing these works, then I think the most important part is to be able to, or rather I would say the most important part for now is to be able to articulate certain things in a certain way. I understand your question about audiences, but we also feel that there are, and this is where contemporary art comes in, that we are not, yes, you're rooted in the region, you're rooted in the context of certain materials, certain aesthetics, certain histories of tradition, but at the end of the day, you are speaking about concerns that people can relate to. So at some point, if one looks at commoditization, if one looks at commodification, or let's just say, consumption at large, there is a similarity between what is happening in Ladakh and what is happening in Delhi. I mean, more so. Like last year, we were getting, I mean, in the middle of the winter, I was making prawn cocktail, with frozen prawns being flown in from Delhi, So life in Leh is not going to be very different from life in Delhi in a couple of years or in a couple of decades. So, these are also ways in which we are trying to, these are also ways in which these kind of regions are trying to get used to ideas of globalization and then frame their narratives or their articulation in that context, So I know I'm not answering your question.
Abeer, but could I interrupt you here, Rudy?
Yes, please.
Which is to, the sort of, the sort of thing that we all trip over, or one of the pitfalls of speaking of Leh as Ladakh.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. In this particular, I mean, if I were to speak of my project around Islam, I have a much wider field that I could have referred to. But unfortunately or fortunately, this is something that is very, very located in the Leh district of Ladakh. So Ladakh is basically two districts, Leh and Kargil, and Leh and Kargil are also the towns which are the headquarters of these districts. So yes, this conversation is largely around Leh. If one were to talk about Kargil, you would be the primary speaker because
but it's just a different sort of different spatialities and temporalities of the globalization that we're speaking of as well.
So thank you for bringing that up. So now to just talk about audience and moving quickly to the idea of representation and then materiality, which were your third and fourth points, that when one speaks of representation, or because that is our bridge to the audience, right? I think the challenge is to be able to create something that connects. I mean, across the board, that image that we've used for the invitation, the image that was first shown of the spindles, with the dyed woolen thread around it, and the undyed woolen cloth, the nambu in the center with the spindle and the ball of wool, is something that hits the mark. And this is where I would like to put the onus back on the artists, that at some level, my role has been to provide with the context Like most of the times the conversations that we have, and even for CISA, even for curatorial in South Asia, and this is where I'd like to take a couple of examples from there, because I was not really able to show any of the works because our exhibition did not open when it was supposed to open. So we leave that conversation for that. But each individual artist, these five, so Tashi, Jigmetangmo, Motup, Tundup, and Chimit, last but not the least, the conversation that we had is that, okay, if we are trying to articulate this concern that you were talking about, that what is the contemporary? I said that you choose for yourself. How is it that you would like the world to see you? So we were kind of discussing about what is it that they would like to tell the world about themselves, about their identities, the materials that they work with, the world that they have constructed. So for instance, Tundup, who is a ceramicist who studied in Vishwabharati in Shantiniketan, had said that, I'm going to create a set of clay tablets, and the clay that you use, and this is where the sub narratives come into play, that the clay, so where is the clay that I'm using coming from? Where are the glazes that I'm using coming from? What are the colors and the textures that I'm being able to achieve in this installation, for instance? So so these matters of representation and materiality is also something where the artistic process comes into space. I mean, I don't want to sort of shift the focus to them and sort of pass the baton, but yeah, in some ways I am, that the way that one has been working is to be able to set the context and to be able to identify some of these concerns, that we can then work with and respond with. And yes, there is, I think, a growing acknowledgement of all of these. And while Leh cannot be compared with Delhi or New York or wherever, but Leh also has a large number of people who are visiting Ladakh. And for them to be able to come and visit a space like this, like the Spindle Art Cafe, is an opportunity to re-look at Ladakh in a different way. And that audience is very important for me. It is not just the audience who are coming to look at art. They are not just art curators and academics and scholars and people who are familiar with the contemporary art, but also regular people. Because when you're in the bazaar or when you're looking at tourism brochures, what do you see? You see the same images that I showed in those 3 slides of the women wearing the traditional costumes. But there is so much to Ladakh beyond that. And that is what a space like this can have to offer, to not just the world, but the people who are coming in to that space.
Thank you, Abeer and Latika, for such an invigorating discussion. And thank you, Latika, for packing a lot of questions into one, the question of ethics, the role of ethnography, and many other things. We have the audience, questions from the audience, and I'm going to relay them to Abeer. In the meantime, I'll ask the audience members, please type your questions in the Q&A box. So we have a question from Professor Amitabh Pandey, who's saying, excellent presentation. How is the continuity and cultural sustainability ensured through the ethnocultural art practice on equity basis?
Oh God, that's a very, yes, it's a, okay, let me just spin my head around that first. Let me start with the word continuity. I think we addressed this point very recently. I think the idea of continuity is identified by the concerns, that we have. Tanveer, that question in the chat box would have helped because there are lots of words in that. Anyway, and the idea of sustainability, I don't know whether you mean as production or as exhibition or as the space, as we were discussing, as an example of the Spindle Art Cafe. But yes, there are models of sustainability that are being discovered. For instance, like Latika also said, after I finished, that, this is a space which is almost self-sustaining itself, not primarily through the sale of artifacts, but through pedagogic models. So there are art classes, there is a cafe that allows certain people to come in, so it draws people in. So yes, the continuity is through the ideas that we are engaging with. The sustainability is through these kind of parallel opportunities that are there, that people can work around. And I've now forgotten, there was something about equity in the end. But Tanvi, please don't delete the questions, because it'll be good if I can like go back and.
No, I didn't know you're watching them also.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yes.
Yeah, here
I
is
mean,
the question.
I think
It's
the equity.
ethnocultural art place on equity basis.
There, Mutup has put it back. Thank you, Mutup. Yes. So. I think the attempt is to kind of go beyond the ethnocultural. I mean, as I constantly am saying, that somewhere the point of contemporary art also is that one is kind of very deeply entrenched in it. That is the context for sure. But at the end of the day, the idea is to be able to link with a set of concerns and ideas just beyond them. I mean, not beyond them to your own region, but ideas that connect all these regions together. So there are certain concerns around environment, around ecology, which are pan-Himalayan. So if there was a Himalayan art, or if there was a Himalayan contemporary art exhibition, then perhaps something needs to be curated around ideas of ecology, rather than and then look at textiles, or then look at craft through that. And equity, I'm not sure what you mean by, but I think all the comments that I've made are in a general sort of space of equity. So let's.
Yeah. There's another question from an anonymous attendee who is asking, how far do the transformations of cultural objects reflect differently in observation of members of different cultures? And what is the role of ethnography to help observers to get the glimpses?
Yes, thank you for that. It's an important one, and it's something that I tried to address in the very beginning. That cultural objects are tricky things. As I said, that they kind of very quickly get classified as souvenirs or craft or antique and stuff like that. But when you say observed by members of different cultures, there is a certain connection that needs to be built. Like there's a certain access. Like for instance, I had to tell. As part of this presentation, that this sort of dual object of the kettle and the base pot is something that is unique to the region of to the Himalayan region, and then etch out the sort of jump that we were doing to the flasks. However, at many levels, so if you first imagine different cultures, even from within Ladakh. I mean, Ladakh is not a monoculture. Let's remember that. I mean, it is not just Buddhists. It's not just, I mean, linguistically, there is tremendous diversity. Culturally and ethnically, there is a lot of diversity as well. So there is a certain circulation that happens within those different cultures within the region. At the next level, if you look at the Raja Himalayas, now here, for instance, again, the exhibition that we are imagining for CISA in Delhi, for the culture curator intensive South Asia, we have someone from Tibet, a young curator called Seron, who lives in Nepal. And she and I have been in conversation about material culture, because there are similarities which go beyond the region into a larger sphere of production. And then there is the next. So we are essentially talking about concentric circles, when we talk about these cultural processes. And ethnography is what, and the observations that, for instance, I made today, perhaps is able to give you, a little access or a little entry point, into understanding these a little better. But at the end of the day, as I was saying earlier, that, when it comes to art or cinema or poetry or literature, it's also the work that has to speak for itself. So it's also the opportunity to work with such talented, young, dynamic minds, which is perhaps the most gratifying of all these experiences. Yeah.
There's a question from Facebook, Abeer. It's from Latika Gupta. It's in the comment box, who is asking, what are you calling globalization? Also creates new peripheries within regions. Leh, Kathmandu, Lhasa then become distant from places that surround them in much the same way that gated complexes in Gurgaon are separate from rural Haryana.
Thank you, Radhika, for that. Well, when I was speaking of globalization, it was essentially about economic globalization and the movement of commodities. But I understand what you're trying to say. Yes, it is creating new peripheries, and they are becoming more than distant, I would say that they are also becoming flattened in certain ways, perhaps sometimes, because, there is this tremendous urge to kind of simplify and sell things as part of global economic systems. So this is a very tricky one. Gurgaon in Haryana is a difficult parallel, but yes, I think one of the things that comes to mind immediately is that this process is also in place within a space like Ladakh internally. If that is one of the things that you're hinting at, that there is this kind of stratification and sort of, organization even within Ladakh. So yes, but I think I'll have to think of this a little bit, Radhika. I mean, it's expected of you, but yeah, I don't think I have immediate.
There's another question from the audience. It's again in the comment box. If ethnography in the past is studying other and contemporary ethnography is studying self, has it to do with museum or not?
Well, I imagine that the study itself is for the individual. And this is where IFA and the projects that we were doing were so important, because the institutions are much, institutions are, they take a little longer, for them to register and respond, to some of these changes. But it is individual exercises like this that triggers, maybe a small bit of change in them. For instance, during our stay in IGRMS, while there were a lot of people who found what we were doing as, a little out of the ordinary for them, because they were usually sticking to the usual narrative, in their program, in their programming, and the kind of events that they organize. But at no point did we face any, not an iota of hostility, because everyone was really interested in understanding what we were trying to do. And when we did the series of curatorial walks, and when I sort of started explaining to them, so yes, there is a layer of interpretation that is required, whether it comes through the text or whether it comes through now with AI and all of that, there are many ways in which we can provide it to the individual without the presence of the curator himself. But yes, I think it's onto the individuals, both curators, researchers, and artists, to kind of keep, sort of chipping away at these institutions and sort of forcing them to, to come up and upgrade their thinking. Mm-hmm.
Tanvi, can I just, can I come in for a second?
Yes,
I just wanted to say that I think, what Abeer said, taking off in a bit of a tangent, that these kind of experiments that we have had with museums, working with institutions, with archives and museums in the country, have, I think, made a little bit of difference. Because like you said, it's presenting collections which are there and have been there for such a long time in through a different lens, through different frameworks. And we hope that this will make a little bit of difference, And like you said, it's not something that will happen immediately. It will take time. But I think it's important that many different stories are told rather than just the one institutional one,
Thank you, Suman. And Abeer, we have one more question. I think it's from my colleague, John Xaviers, who's saying, fantastic, wonderful presentation. And the question, I think, is about, he was fascinated by the Chinese looking flasks made in India for consumption in Ladakh. Would you like to reflect on this liminal space in the context of
it's a very long it's a very long conversation, and I don't know whether we have the time for it, but in a sentence, and this also ties up with what Suman was just saying, that the idea is also, like, I don't think anything that I have said today is either very original or something that we haven't heard before. It's a manner in which you gather those ideas. So there's nothing new about commodification. There is nothing new about the global economy. We are all participants in it in various ways. But the manner in which, and this is the word that I used at the beginning, the manner in which that we engage with a particular idea, and the manner in which we try to articulate it by giving it a form, so that these conversations are facilitated, I think is the point of the conversation. I think the idea is to kind of be able, so when people go into the Spindle Art Cafe and look at the Mother Spindle installation, which is there, it's something that they have not seen before. I mean, especially with the young kids and a lot of the people who come in, and for them, it is an opportunity to ask this question: that what is this? I mean, there are a lot of things in it that are familiar. I mean, they know what that textile is, they know what those implements are, but they don't quite understand how and why they've been put together. So if we look at contemporary art practice simply in being able to provide a set of provocations, in being able to, or for that matter, this kind of work is also being done in areas such as speculative design and so on, where we are not just designing or creating something for consumption, but it's something that provokes a conversation, that initiates us to reflect upon something which is very part and parcel of our lives, but we perhaps don't get an opportunity to stop and think about it.
Thank you, Abeer. I think that's it from the audience also. And I think we should end it here. Unless there is any other question in the comment box. I can't see any, and there are none in the Q&A box also. So that's about it for today, I think, in that case. And thank you very much for this wonderful presentation and telling us how curatorial interventions can go beyond the ascribed meanings of the ethnographic objects in museums, and also exploring the idea of the museum being the site of memory, or is there anything beyond it? And more importantly, the idea, the role of the curator and the ethical responsibility while dealing with the ethnographic objects in museums that are far sometimes removed from the context, and how the meanings kind of lead to different journeys afterwards. In this case, your artistic and curatorial intervention after the chansa. It was wonderful to have you, and thank you very much for the audience, also to the audience members who continued with us throughout the presentation. So for the next, I wanted to do a little announcement about the next presentation, which is going to happen on the project showcase on 24th of February at 6:30 p.m. We will have Gitanjali Sayal with us, who will present her project that explores how Art Deco, which is an architectural style which was pretty much in vogue during the colonial times. So she's going to take us through her work in progress project, which looks at Delhi in particular, that how Art Deco architectural style shaped and contributed to the shaping of cultural identity of Delhi as a city during the British Raj. So we'll see all of you on 24th of Feb. Until then, stay safe and stay well. Goodbye and good night.
Goodbye. Goodbye, everyone.